The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark. and I didn't want to leave the food outside. She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned Blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old Blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years, and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face. and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So, I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared, he was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. "What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there." Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him. A man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man. The truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive.
The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides. their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life.
The strangers in the elevator. It was late, and the tall apartment building loomed against the foggy sky, its dim lights flickering in the mist. The street was quiet and empty, except for the occasional sound of distant traffic. I want to take a walk to enjoy the fresh air a bit. As I walked towards the elevator, the air suddenly became cold, making me shiver. The sliding doors opened. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator began descending, but suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened with a faint creak, and a woman was standing there. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, and her messy hair hung down over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. A sense of unease crept over me as I noticed she was barefoot. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if in pain. Her head remained bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, but something about her appearance left me confused and uneasy. Her dress was dirty, and she looked like she might be homeless. Her gaze remained fixed on the elevator floor, even though there was nothing there. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I hurried out without even looking back. I quickly left the building. A little while later, I returned to the building, brushing off my thoughts, and stepped inside. As I pressed the button for the 8th floor, the elevator began to rise, but stopped again at the 6th floor. The elevator doors opened, and a horrifying sight greeted me. She was standing there, and I froze. Then, she began crawling frantically toward me. Panicking, I quickly pressed the close button, just in time before she could reach me, and the elevator doors shut. The next day, as I approached the elevator, a sense of anxiety washed over me. The elevator descended, stopping once again at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened, and this time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. I began to whisper, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man turned to look at me, his face showing pain, mumbling and then saying,
"I've lost something. My stomach hurts so much."
Then he collapsed onto the floor, his hands searching the ground for something I couldn't see. Everything felt eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I went to the management office, but they said no such person existed. Still unsettled, I went to the mailroom to pick up some things, and that's when I began to piece things together. When I opened my mailbox, one thing caught my eye: the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 apartments were listed, 601 and 602, along with the water bill. Oddly, I noticed 602's water bill was abnormally high. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after working late. When the elevator doors slid open, a large man was holding a long, heavy golf bag. It had a strange smell, a faint metallic tang wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The 6th floor button was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag into the dark hallway toward apartment 602. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark, like blood, on the floor. What was he carrying? Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. Finally, I picked up my phone and called the police. The police entered the building, heading straight for the 6th floor, to apartment 602. Inside apartment 602, they found a makeshift surgical room. Blood was everywhere. They also found a freezer and the suspicious golf bag. Inside were corpses. Their organs had been removed. The police uncovered evidence of organ trafficking taking place right in my building. At that moment, I asked them about the barefoot man and woman I had encountered in the elevator, but they said there was no one like that in the building as I described. I requested to see the elevator surveillance footage. When the video played, I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone and talking to no one. I was frozen in shock. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The victims found were all homeless people. Those I encountered might have been spirit souls of those taken by the traffickers, still searching for something, perhaps pieces of their own bodies.
The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift. It was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him, Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing.
Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him. The man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder, the creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as 2 officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there!" "He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow, I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again.
Horror story: The Strange Man with Red Eyes. This happened 6 years ago when I was working the night shift as a security guard in an old office building. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again. That night, the pale moonlight cast an eerie glow over the deserted scene, creating a chilling atmosphere. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my final patrol before ending my shift. As I walked through the dark hallway, I heard strange footsteps. I looked around, but saw no one. The footsteps continued, seeming to come closer to me. I started feeling uneasy, trying to stay calm and continue my work. But just as I reached the security room, the door suddenly opened. A man with disheveled hair and bloodshot eyes walked in. He was wearing a long black coat and carrying an old suitcase. There was no one around, and I couldn't understand how he got into the building at this hour. I swallowed nervously, trying to speak to him.
"Do you need any help?"
I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me for a long moment. Then he opened his mouth, his voice raspy like the wind through a crack in the door.
"I need to go to a very special place, a place you will never forget."
I didn't understand his meaning, but I responded anyway.
"I can't leave the building during my shift. Can you specify the location?"
The man smiled in a strange way, his thin lips curling up.
"All right, take me to the basement."
I was surprised, but didn't want to cause trouble, so I nodded and led him there. We stepped into the elevator, the air inside becoming oppressive. When the elevator doors opened at the basement level, a cold draft swept in. The man stepped out first, and I followed, feeling more anxious. He stopped in front of a small room, its door long locked. I didn't remember ever seeing this room before. The man pulled out an old key from his coat pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. I stood outside, not daring to follow.
"I've reached my destination,"
he said from inside. "Thank you for guiding me." I turned to leave, but suddenly, he appeared right in front of me, as quick as lightning. He placed his hand on my shoulder, gripping so tightly that it hurt.
Remember, you have helped me, and I will remember you.
I screamed, trying to break free, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I collapsed. My eyes gradually closed. I gradually saw the door of the room closing before my eyes, accompanied by his satisfied, creepy laughter. And then I fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed. The doctor said I had a heart attack, but was lucky to survive. I recalled the man and asked everyone around about him, but no one had seen him, and the security cameras recorded no one but me. From the video extracted from the camera, it seems that I was talking to myself in front of the hallway door and then collapsed on the floor. It seems that I was taken to the hospital by the neighbors. I was haunted by his final look and his mysterious words. I could never forget that raspy voice. And every time I remember, I feel a chill down my spine. I had once guided a mysterious man, and it had changed my life forever. The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with the daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened. And tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. When I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me, his eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. Red bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait! Wait!
The man called out. She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted,
Help me! Help me! Help me!
As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. "Well, you." His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied, I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue. She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had 2 exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as 2 officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years, stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact, all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. Mysterious invitation in the basement. The warm afternoon sun spread across the school campus as the students left for the day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about that week. That was the week Justin arrived. He was a new student, showing up in the middle of the semester without warning. He was quiet, maybe a little strange, but friendly enough. He sat next to me in class because there happened to be an empty seat, and soon enough, we started talking. Justin always seemed distant, like he was hiding something and rarely talked about himself. He just said he had recently moved to our town. There was something odd about him, but I brushed it aside. I thought everyone had their quirks. A few weeks later, he invited me over to his house. I was a bit surprised by this. He told me to come around 7 p.m. I wasn't particularly excited, but I agreed. After all, he was new to town, and I thought he could use a friend. That night, I took a bus to his neighborhood and started walking to find Justin's house. His home was in a rundown area. The houses were small, and the streets were eerily quiet. The porch light was off when I arrived, and the windows were dark. I texted Justin to let him know I was there. After a minute with no reply, I moved closer to the front door. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was almost pitch black. The house was silent, except for a faint noise coming from somewhere deep inside. I stood at the entrance, calling out for Justin, but there was no answer. My phone buzzed, and finally, he responded, "Come in. I'm in the basement." I went down the basement stairs. The sound of a TV or video game echoed from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the noise grew louder as I approached. I figured Justin was playing something. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, with just a faint light flickering. As I descended, the sounds of gunfire and explosions became clearer, but something felt wrong. I called out to Justin again, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. It was pitch black, except for the flicker of a TV somewhere in the distance. I moved forward, inching through the darkness, toward the faint light. I called out again, louder this time, "Justin," but still nothing. Suddenly, I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I stumbled and hit the ground face first. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for a moment, stunned. Laughter echoed through the basement. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing. I turned, trying to see who had pushed me, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then came another shove, harder this time, sending me sprawling to the floor again. The laughter started up once more. It felt like I was being toyed with. Panic hit me. My legs were trembling. Someone kicked my legs as I tried to stand, knocking me down again. I had to get out now. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick concrete floor. My heart pounded in my chest. Footsteps echoed behind me, and the laughter still rang in my ears. My hands fumbled in the dark, desperately searching for the railing. My foot caught on the bottom step, and I stumbled, but I managed to catch myself. I burst through the front door and ran. When I got home, I texted Justin, wanting to know what the hell had just happened, but he never responded. The next day at school, I expected him to show up and either laugh it off or offer an explanation. But Justin didn't say a word. He sat there, silent, avoiding my gaze. Then, one Monday, he was gone. His desk was empty, with no books or belongings. There were rumors that he had moved away, but no one seemed to care. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment I was shoved and the laughter that followed me. It felt like I was being hunted. I still wondered if it had been Justin or someone else down there with me. And then I remembered something I had overlooked in the chaos. When I first entered the basement, there were more footsteps than just mine. I didn't dare go back to Justin's house after that day. I'm glad I escaped that house. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved and without knowing, but the questions I wonder still haunt me and push me to find them. I don't know if I should. Mysterious invitation in the basement. It's been weeks since Justin disappeared. Despite my best efforts to move on, my mind kept going back to that basement. The laughter, the shoves, the darkness. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it haunted me. There was a nagging feeling inside me I needed answers. Tonight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and a message was sent. It seemed like spam. Hey Ken, long time no see. Just remember to stay away from it. I didn't know what the warning was about, or what I was supposed to stay away from. But my mind kept repeating, could it be Justin? I couldn't keep living with this fear. If Justin had any answers, I was going to get them tonight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Justin's house looked just as it had when I left it, dark and unsettling. The eerie silence of the neighborhood made me anxious. The front door was ajar, just like before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, and my footsteps echoed through the empty space, each step sending chills down my spine. The fear I had felt weeks ago crept back in. I cautiously headed straight for the basement. The door was wide open. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended into the pitch-black void. I gripped my phone tightly, using its light to guide me, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper inside. Slowly, I saw it something I had missed before. In the faint glow of my phone, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged and confusing like runes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention. I swept my phone around, and there, at the far end of the basement, I saw him, Justin. He stood still, his face pale, eyes wide, lifeless and empty, staring straight at me. My voice caught in my throat as I called his name. Justin? He didn't respond. He didn't move. Whether it was my eyes or the darkness, he seemed half visible, almost translucent in the dim light of my phone, like he wasn't even there. I cautiously moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the whispering began. It started small, unintelligible, but grew louder. Fear crept in. He was muttering something in a language I couldn't understand, then told me,
You shouldn't have come back.
Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. I wasn't in the present anymore. I was seeing something from years ago. I saw Justin standing in the basement with his strange mother. They stood around a table covered with old books and candles. Justin seemed forced into it, his face filled with fear and resignation. The candles flickered, and suddenly, Justin froze. He stared at something in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged with eyes burning like fire. The figure reached out, and in a flash, everything stopped. I was back in the present, gasping for air. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the basement. Justin's body twitched, his mouth curling into a grotesque, twisted smile as he said,
It never left. It's been waiting for you.
I tried to move, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt invisible, icy hands pulling me down. But just as I was about to be swallowed by some unseen darkness, I saw Justin, his real face. It was different from before. He looked pitiful, as if he were trapped. He whispered faintly,
Help me, please.
In that moment, it hit me, had Justin never left the basement? Had he been trapped here all this time? I screamed his name, Justin, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I heard was the basement door slamming shut above me, locking us inside. Then I opened my eyes. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I was in my bed, in my room, with the faint light of dawn creeping through the window. It felt like hours had passed, but when I glanced at the clock, only a few minutes had gone by. I had no idea when I had fallen asleep. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. It made me think about the questions I had sought answers for, but that dream made me stop. Was it a warning to keep me away from all of it? I think I will never go back there again. The uninvited guest. Ava and her fiancé, Jay, decided to host a dinner party to celebrate his mother's recovery. The house was bustling with final touches on the decorations, ensuring everything was ready. She had hired a server to assist her in serving their family and friends. The server arrived on time as scheduled. As soon as he walked in, Ava noticed an unpleasant odor coming from him, which made her uncomfortable, especially since he would be preparing food for her family. But she forced a polite smile. As the server unpacked his utensils, he kept glancing at Ava, asking for her opinion on spices, telling her to taste the food, and seeking her input on presentation. But she politely said she trusted his taste, as he was the chef after all. Soon it was 5:45 p.m. Guests were about to arrive, yet he was still there. After reminding him twice, she bluntly told him she needed him to finish everything and be out by 6 o'clock. He apologized, claiming her oven wasn't maintaining the right temperature, a problem Ava had never encountered before. As guests started arriving, the server finally began packing up his things. But instead of heading to the door, he suddenly walked toward Ava's bedroom. Ava, confused and worried, called after him and asked where he was going. He mumbled something about needing to change clothes. Feeling uncomfortable, she told him there was another bathroom outside, but he ignored her and went inside, locking the door. Ava found Jay and explained the strange behavior she had noticed from the server. Together, they went to the room and demanded he come out. When he appeared, he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, but his expression darkened. "This isn't your house." Jay told him that he was Ava's fiancé and they lived there. The server went berserk, screaming about how Ava had seduced him, babbling nonsense that she couldn't understand. Then, he rushed into the kitchen, throwing food out of the fridge and onto the floor without hesitation. He screamed obscenities, his face twisted with rage. Jay had to call on his two brothers to forcibly remove the server. Fortunately, the party still proceeded as planned. Around 5 a.m., Ava woke with a start to the sound of a door creaking open. She nudged Jay awake, whispering that someone was inside the house. He tried to reassure her, saying maybe his brother had forgotten something like his wallet. But then, the noise grew louder, coming from outside. Jay told her he'd check it out while she should hide in the closet and call 911. Before she could dial, a familiar, disturbing voice echoed through the room. She stepped into the living room and saw the server, shirtless, his eyes wild with madness. He lunged at Ava, but Jay blocked him, holding him down while she called the police. Jay warned the server, "The police are on their way," but the server just smiled, "I need to make sure she's okay and unharmed." Jay stayed between them as Ava climbed out of the window. The server broke free from Jay's grip and ran into the kitchen. Just in time, when the police arrived, the server was in the kitchen, swinging a knife wildly. He ignored the police's orders to drop the weapon, forcing them to subdue him with a taser. The police searched the entire house, finding nothing unusual except one thing. Ava suddenly remembered that he had gone into her room. Upon checking, she realized some of her clothes and personal items were missing. Afterward, Ava and Jay cleaned the house, discarding everything the server had touched. They replaced all the kitchen items and made the house feel like home again. The server was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but the trauma and violation he caused still haunted Ava. She was grateful, though, that Jay had stood by her and protected her, helping her recover from the emotional ordeal. The last ride. I had been driving for Uber for about 6 months, mostly at night. The pay wasn't great, but the quiet streets and dark city made it tolerable. People always had their own stories to tell, and most rides were uneventful. Drunk passengers, late-night partygoers, or quiet workers returning home. But one night changed everything. It was a Friday, a little past 1 a.m. I was sitting in my car, parked near the downtown area, waiting for my next fare. The streets were mostly empty, a light mist hanging in the air. My phone pinged with a new ride request. The pickup was in an isolated area on the outskirts of town, where the streetlights were few and far between. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted the ride. As I drove through the quiet streets, the mist thickened into a fog, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. The GPS directed me down a narrow, winding road, surrounded by trees on both sides. I glanced at my phone. Destination, a spot marked only as unknown road. The location seemed remote, almost too remote, but I shrugged it off. People lived in weird places all the time. When I pulled up to the pickup location, there was no house, just a dirt path leading into the woods. I waited, glancing nervously at the trees, their branches looming overhead like skeletal fingers. My phone chimed again, a message from the rider. "I'll be right out." I watched the darkness, waiting for someone to emerge, but minutes passed and no one appeared. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the fog, walking slowly toward the car. My headlights illuminated a tall man, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but something about him felt off. He opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. The man didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he said in a low, raspy voice,
Just drive.
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cancel the ride and get out of there, but I didn't want to make a scene. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the shadows of the back seat. As I drove, the fog thickened, making it hard to see the road ahead. The man remained silent, his presence heavy and unsettling. Every now and then I'd glance in the mirror, and he'd just be sitting there, motionless. The tension in the car was suffocating. After a few minutes, I broke the silence. "So, where exactly are we going?" The man slowly turned his head to face me. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
We're going home.
He whispered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's home?" He leaned forward, his face now partially visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, empty.
Yours.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper. A wave of terror washed over me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart raced as I turned to confront him, but the back seat was empty. The door was still locked, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. I turned in my seat, but the back seat was completely empty. The man was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and checked the ride. The request had vanished, as if it had never existed. There was no record of the trip, no rider profile, nothing. I sped away from the spot, the fog swallowing the road behind me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling as I did so. I don't know what I encountered, but the image of the man's sunken eyes and his cold words echoed in my mind and seemed impossible to forget. I never drove for Uber again after that night, and every time I pass by that isolated road, I feel a cold dread settle in my chest. Somewhere out there, the man in the dark coat is still waiting for his next ride. Whispers from the trunk of the car. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon. I was walking through my small town, enjoying the fresh air and getting some exercise as usual. The streets were quite empty, which was normal for this place. As I turned onto a quieter street, I saw him a man standing by the sidewalk. He wore a baseball cap, a white shirt tucked in messily, and a pair of ripped jeans. At first glance, there was nothing strange about him. The man approached me slowly, his steps unhurried, as if he had been waiting for someone like me to pass by. My heart started to race, though I tried to keep my expression calm. He started making small talk, asking for my name, my phone number, and whether I lived nearby. I began to feel uneasy. He was too friendly, asking questions too quickly, as if trying to pry information out of me. I gave brief, vague answers, avoiding any personal details, but he persisted. I was alert, clutching my phone and the ring on my finger, a gift from my grandfather that I cherished. Then came the question that sent waves of anxiety through me. He smiled and asked if he could give me a ride home, saying he'd be happy to get to know me and chat. I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "No thanks, I'm fine. I can walk on my own." I continued walking, my mind swirling. Something about him made me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I didn't want to appear rude or draw attention, so I kept my pace steady. Just when I thought the encounter was over, he called out to me again. "Hey, come over to my car. I want to show you something in the back." His words were casual, but enough to make me pause. I hesitated, but then a thought crossed my mind. What if he was one of those YouTubers pulling a prank or filming hidden camera content? I decided to take the risk, but stayed cautious. I followed him to his car, which was parked nearby. My steps were slow, and my eyes stayed on him the whole time. He walked to the front of the car, grabbing something like a cloth, and told me to wait a moment while he opened the trunk. But he kept fumbling with the controls, like the car wasn't his. Suddenly, from inside the car, I heard a faint sound, like a quiet cry for help. If I hadn't listened closely, I might have missed it. I took a slow step closer. Without thinking, I pressed the button beneath the trunk to open it. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. Inside the trunk were a girl and a boy. They were both tied up, their eyes wide with terror. They looked at me with desperate fear, and it filled me with both horror and rage. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man didn't notice that I had opened the trunk. I turned to face him, and without thinking, I charged forward, my fist landing squarely on his face. I demanded to know why they were there. The man staggered backward, clutching his nose, mumbling something about selling organs. I punched him again and again, trying to knock some sense into him. Each punch was fueled by the thought of what could have happened to those kids and what might have happened to me. Finally, he collapsed, dazed and bleeding on the ground. I didn't waste any time. I ran to the trunk and untied the ropes around the kid's wrists and ankles. I pulled out my phone and called the police. The whole time I stood guard over the man, making sure he didn't get up or try to run. I reassured the kids, promising them everything would be okay. The police arrived and cuffed the man. He paid the price sentence to 37 years in prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. As I sit here, reflecting on that day, I think about what could have happened if I hadn't acted. I would have been just another victim, another name on a list of people who didn't survive. I am grateful. I trusted my instincts. The Haunting of Jefferson High. Jefferson High School was an old building with a rich history. It had been around for over a century, with stories of hauntings passed down from generation to generation. As a senior, I never believed the tales until the night I decided to stay late to finish a project. It was a stormy evening, the perfect setting for a horror story. The rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The school was eerily silent, with only the occasional creak of the old wooden floors breaking the stillness. My friend Emily had promised to stay with me, but she bailed at the last minute, leaving me alone in the dimly lit library. I was deep into my research when I heard it, a faint whisper. I looked up, scanning the rows of bookshelves, but saw nothing. Shaking it off as my imagination, I continued working. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could make out words.
Help me.
My heart raced as I stood up, the sound seemingly coming from the far corner of the library. Clutching my phone for light, I walked towards the sound. As I neared the corner, the air grew colder, and the whispering grew more desperate. I turned the corner and saw an old, dusty book lying on the floor. The whispering stopped. Oh. Hesitantly, I picked up the book and opened it. Inside, there were handwritten notes dating back decades, detailing the mysterious disappearance of a student named Sarah Mitchell in 1953. According to the notes, Sarah had stayed late one night to finish a project, just like me. She was last seen in the library, and rumors had it that her spirit never left. Chills ran down my spine as I read about strange occurrences reported by students over the years, books flying off shelves, cold spots, and whispers for help. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. I turned around to leave. The library door slammed shut on its own. Panic set in as I rushed to the door, pulling with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. My phone's light flickered, and in the dim glow, I saw her, a translucent figure of a girl standing by the window, her eyes filled with sorrow.
Help me.
She whispered again, her voice echoing in the empty room. I froze, unable to move or speak. Sarah's ghost floated closer, her hand reaching out to me. In a flash, images flooded my mind. Her being locked in the library, crying for help, and eventually succumbing to despair. Summoning all my courage, I asked, "How can I help you?" Grabbing a pen, I wrote down her final words as she dictated them to me. She spoke of feeling trapped, alone, and scared, and how she longed for someone to find her. As I finished writing, the room grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Sarah's ghost smiled faintly before fading away, leaving me alone in the now silent library. The door creaked open, and I knew she was finally at peace. The next day, I reported the incident to the school authorities, who were skeptical but intrigued. They placed the book in a display case in the library, honoring Sarah's memory. Jefferson High was still old and creaky, but from that day on, the whispers for help ceased, and Sarah Mitchell's spirit was finally free. The Yin and Yang Train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year, on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly, Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. Horror story about a truck driver. I started driving trucks at the age of 25 and also encountered many strange cases on the road. I'm pretty sure I've encountered a few UFO while driving at night and occasionally encountered many strange drivers. The story I share with you today is the most horrifying and strange experience I have ever witnessed. In observation, I was 37 years old in 2009. That night was like most nights. I drove and listened to music on the radio, drinking some coffee to keep myself awake. The roads here are very deserted and covered in fog. Gradually, the fog got thicker and thicker, and I started thinking about whether I should pull over for a while or keep driving. I thought so, but in the end, I still chose to continue driving. At this time, There was no one on the country road, so it was probably safe to continue driving. To prevent bad situations from happening, such as an animal or something running across the road, I drove slowly. While I was concentrating on driving, I suddenly smelled something. I thought the smell of sodium carbonate was the worst smell I had ever smelled, but this smell is much worse. This smell quickly filled the inside of my truck. I quickly rolled up the window, but the smell didn't get much better. This horrible smell in my car, and I feel like I could vomit immediately. This smell mixed with the bones creates a disgusting smell. I think nothing can cause a more terrible stench than this. At the same time, I felt an uncomfortable feeling in my throat. That feeling when you want to vomit, but have to hold back. Opened the car door and started vomiting. When I was done, I quickly covered my nose because the smell was still in the air. I got in the car and calmed myself down to start driving again. That's when I noticed something crossing the road. The figure was of a man, and he was limping. In addition to his limping gait, I also noticed that the man was wearing an old white button-down shirt and black slacks. I reminisced about the strange and bizarre cases I had encountered. I don't know what to do with that man. Finally, I decided to drive over to ask if he was okay and if he needed me to call for help. Before I drove up to him, I soon realized that 4 more people were coming out from the side of the road. They were all going in the same direction as the first man I saw. They all walked with a strange limp. They all wore old-fashioned peasant clothes. What I found most strange was that they didn't realize there was a big truck going on the other side of the road. I thought to myself, if these people needed help, they would definitely come towards me. However, they all continued to limp across the street, disappearing into the darkness and fog. I emphasized again that I was in the middle of the speedway, meaning there were no houses or anything around. Then another figure stepped out from the darkness and kept crossing the street. However, this figure is much shorter. I got out of my truck, but didn't go to that kid. I just stood there, staring at it. It didn't seem to pay any attention to me. It continued to cross the road. The boy's gait and the clothes he wore were as strange as the previous ones. Just as the boy was about to reach the other end of the street, I shouted,
"Do you need any help?"
The boy stopped and turned his head to face me. My heart sank as soon as. It is a body without a face. I cursed under my breath and stood there in fear. Then, it let out the most terrible scream I've ever heard, limping towards me but at a faster speed than before. I quickly got into the truck and slammed the door. The horrifying screams became more and more frequent, louder, and more people came out from the darkness. I quickly drove away from the boy, accelerating to get out of this place as soon as possible. During the escape, those people were approaching, all of them faceless. When I drove to a residential area, I stopped at a gas station. I just sat there in my truck because my mind and heart were still shaking. My mind was blank. This experience has opened up so many things to me. I understand that this world is really strange, and there will always exist things that we never think about. Stalkers in the dark. I started working as a security guard, night shifting at a small shopping mall in the city right after graduating high school. This job was supposed to be simple. Sit in front of the screen, watch people come and go, and occasionally handle shoplifters or suspicious behavior. But the truth is, the nights can be long, even boring. Until Black Friday arrived in the month leading up to Halloween. I had heard stories about the chaos, people acting as if they were clawing to get the best deals. It was madness, pushing and shoving like a zombie apocalypse. This year, I was scheduled for the dreaded Black Friday shift. It was my second year, and I thought I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the note. When I arrived for my shift that evening, I found a note waiting for me on my desk, right in front of the row of CCTV monitors. It simply read, "If you're in the dark, stay indoors. It was puzzling, and I had no idea who it was meant for or what it referred to. I felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank or something the cleaning crew accidentally left behind. I didn't want to dwell on it and focused on my job. As soon as the mall opened, chaos ensued. People pushed and shoved, scrambling for discounted items. Every walkie-talkie on the team was buzzing non-stop. We had 10 security guards on duty, and it still wasn't enough to manage the madness. Late in the evening, things calmed down a bit until I received a call over the radio. A group of men was reportedly mugging someone with a knife in the third-floor parking lot. I quickly decided to check the cameras to see what I was getting into. As I unlocked the door and swung it open, I nearly bumped into someone. There was a strange man sitting inside. He was standing in front of the screen, wearing a red and green Christmas outfit. His head turned toward the monitor, making me freeze. He slowly turned his face toward me, a pair of sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the room was pitch black. Before I could say a word, he stepped closer, his face just inches from mine, flashing a toothy grin, sharp teeth like a shark's. "Did you get my note?" I reached for the walkie-talkie, but before I could do anything, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I raised my hands, bracing for him to lunge at me, but instead, I felt nothing. I shone the flashlight, and he had vanished, leaving the room empty with just me standing there. I tried to calm myself and refocus on my pressing duties. The dimly lit corridors of the mall were filled with strange decorations, shadows, and the faint echo of creepy sound effects coming from the nearby costume shop. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. A life-sized mannequin in the costume shop window. It was dressed in an outfit identical to that of the strange man. I turned to look behind me as I heard a noise coming from behind, glancing through the shop's glass. The mannequin was no longer inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a raspy laugh behind me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there he was, the man, grinning horrifically and then lunging toward me. I stumbled back, narrowly dodging him. I weaved between the aisles and ran up the escalator, my heart pounding as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it tight behind me. I quickly accessed the camera feeds, searching for any sign of the man. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the screens, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Then, on one of the feeds, I saw him standing in the hallway just outside the security room, staring directly into the camera, a sinister smile plastered across his face, waving at me. I grabbed the walkie again, calling for backup, but the signal was distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I hurriedly fumbled for my flashlight. A creaking sound like claws scraping the door echoed. I braced myself, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, as the door swung open and he stepped inside, laughing mockingly at my fear. I remembered the emergency lever behind the desk. Without hesitation, I rushed over, pulling it down just as he reached for me. He lunged at me, and we got caught in a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at me as I tried to push him away. We slammed into the metal shelves, the impact echoing throughout the room. I pulled the walkie from my belt, calling for backup again. My voice trembled with tension, but I just hoped someone would hear me. After a tense struggle, I pushed him away one last time, and he staggered. This time, I seized the opportunity, quickly grabbing a metal rod nearby and locking it against the door, trapping him inside. I quickly called for assistance. I stood guard at the door, listening to his screams from the other side. Within minutes, 2 officers ran down the hallway, guns drawn. They reached me I unlocked the door, stepping back as they stormed in. I watched as they put him into the police car, his eyes still fixed on me until the very last moment. Back in the security room, I sat down, exhausted but relieved. I scrolled through the camera feeds, carefully checking each one. Then on the feed from the costume shop, I noticed something odd. A new mannequin, dressed in the same outfit, stood in the display window. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a mannequin, right? As I looked, a shadow moved behind it, just a flicker, barely visible. My hand hovered over the controls, but I shook my head to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for me out there to confront it. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine, a quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, we struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over.